And good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight for this debate on question 2. I'm Adam Bagney of NBC 10. We are live here in Fall River at the Jackson Arts Center on the campus of Bristol Community College. Tonight, we'll be discussing both sides of this referendum, which voters will decide upon in just 2 weeks. The new proposed law would allow the state to approve up to 12 new public charter schools per year, increasing their overall enrollment by up to 1% annually. I want to thank the sponsors of tonight's event, NBC 10, Bristol Community College, and South Coast Media. As for the rules, both sides will be giving opening and closing statements tonight, the order of which was decided by a coin toss. There will be a 2-minute limit on responses to questions, and follow-ups may be a minute or 30 seconds. However, a discussion may continue or end at my discretion. We should also note that only I have decided what questions will be asked tonight, and neither side has reviewed them. The audience has agreed to remain silent this evening in order to foster the best possible debate, except for right now as we introduce tonight's panelists. Representing the Yes campaign, a Democrat from the 1st Bristol and Plymouth District, State Senator Michael Rodrigues. The Executive Director of the Massachusetts Charter Public School Association, Mark Kennan. And their Director of Family Engagement, Julia Mejia. And representing the No campaign, the co-chair of the Boston Public Schools Citywide Parents Council, Hashan Barents-Waramuni. I got that one right, thankfully. And the president of the Fall River Educators Association, Rebecca Cusick. And the co-chair of the American Tourette's Association's Massachusetts chapter, Michael Robinson. And let's begin now with an opening statement from Senator Rodrigues.
Thank you, Adam. And first of all, let me thank you for agreeing to moderate this evening, and for CJ and the entire team at Fall River Community Media. I know it's a lot of work putting this all together, so thank you all very much. Good evening, everyone. I'm State Senator Michael Rodrigues. I'm happy to have the opportunity to be here for this important debate tonight. We should constantly be debating on finding ways to improve and enhance educational opportunities for all of our kids, because that is why we are here tonight. Massachusetts is the birthplace of public education in the United States, and we're home to the very best public schools in the country. Supporting traditional public schools and supporting charter public schools are not mutually exclusive. I support charter public schools, as I support traditional public schools, as I support vocational schools, agricultural schools, and universal pre-K, because there is nothing more important than educating our children. In Fall River, there are families who can afford private or parochial schools as a different educational option for their children, and there are families who cannot afford those options. Why should the ability to choose the best educational model for your child be limited to only those with financial means? Whether you're from the Highlands or the Flint, Maplewood or Corky Row, I believe every parent deserves the right to choose the best public school for their child. Public schools do not drain money from school districts. The Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation did the math, and their report was affirmed by both the Boston Globe and the Boston Herald. And after all, how often do these two newspapers agree on anything? This debate is not about whether or not charter schools take money away from our district schools. It is about whether or not economically disadvantaged families have the right and the ability to choose the best options for educating their children. We need to put partisan politics aside and come together to expand access to public education. Supporting charter public schools is not a Democratic thing to do. It's not a Republican thing to do. It's the right thing to do. Every family, regardless of their income, deserves to have a choice in their child's education, because in education, one size does not fit all.
Thanks, Senator Rodrigues. Now an opening statement from I'd ask the audience to please hold your applause tonight. And a comment now, an opening statement from Mr. Barents-Waramuni.
Thank you. First of all, I'm incredibly honored to be here. I spent a Thanksgiving many years ago in Fall River, and unfortunately I have not had the pleasure to come back. I just wanted to very quickly say that I have two kids in the Boston Public Schools, two daughters. One is 12, the other is 14. They went to a level 3 school, which had 900 or so students, economically disadvantaged students, around about 72%, 78% kids of color. I go to, very proudly, a school system that is 87% children of color. We have 4,000 homeless students, and it is on behalf of them, as well as parochial school students and existing charter school students, that I argue against ballot question number 2. Very quickly, as Adam has already said, up to 12 new charters a year is what we're discussing, forever, anywhere, without any local input and without any additional funding. We will not only hurt, once again, existing public schools, but parochial schools and existing charter schools. I do know my birds and bees, and one of the things that I will tell you is that kids do not grow on trees, and it will drain money and resources from every single school system. 182 school committees, the people that actually decide on budgets, argue, make deep cuts, or increase budgets, those school committees have already voted no. There has been no school committee that has voted yes. The Massachusetts Municipal Association has also voted, and I have to stop, has also come out against this, and I will look forward to spending a little bit more time talking about the actual local cuts, such as the $12 million that Fall River is projected to lose as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. I'm going to start with a question for the Yes campaign, and a lot of what everyone's talking about, and that's money. This ballot question does not directly address how to pay for charter schools. A report earlier this year from Education Week found that only 8 states have a larger financial disparity between their richest and poorest school districts than Massachusetts. 6 districts spent more than $25,000 per student, but 7 spent less than $11,000. Why should voters approve a measure that doesn't really address these important funding issues?
Well, Adam, the data you just outlined is actually exactly the reason why we need to pass this ballot question, that there is tremendous disparity in public education in Massachusetts from district to district. In fact, Boston has one of the highest achievement gaps of any city in the entire country. So you actually explained the problem we have across the state, where underprivileged families without means, are suffering as a result of lack of funding, lack of support, lack of commitment in communities to the educating of all children, those particularly in the highest need. So it's exactly because of this disparity in Massachusetts, in our cities particularly, between rich families and those of lesser means, between students of color and Caucasian students, that we have to take drastic steps to be able to try to rectify what is the inequality in our public education system. So charter schools are only one tool that we employ to do that. We advocate for charter schools as a way to provide those choices for families that don't otherwise have choices. Many families in the districts, Adam, you mentioned, that pay $20,000, $25,000 a year have multiple choices for their families. I live in a region out in Western Mass where I had choices for my family. But many families in this state do not have those choices, and it's not fair that only families in wealthy districts have choices, and those families in lower income communities don't have their choices. So we advocate strongly for this. It's just one way to try to address that inequality that permeates our public education system.
Let's get a response now from someone from the No campaign. That's a big disparity, 25 grand per student, but 7 had less than $11,000. Why aren't charter schools the answer?
I would say that last year, the Bipartisan Foundation Budget Review Commission did a study of the education funding in the state of Massachusetts and found that it is severely underfunded to the tune of $1 billion. Wealthier communities are able to commit more than the minimum net school spending requirement, and that's why some communities spend more than communities like Fall River. We know in Fall River what underfunding looks like, and we know what it looks like up close. Last spring, we were forced to cut millions from our school budget. We now have less people to service our students, regardless of the serious need for more. 3 of our schools cut the extended learning time for our kids. If question 2 passes, despite what the ads say, struggling gateway communities will have no choice but to cut deeper or to close schools.
Thanks, Mrs. Cusick. I'm going to follow up with now a no question as well. Currently, just 4% of Massachusetts public school students attend a charter. Now, this proposed law would only allow an increase in enrollment of up to 1% per year. Considering it would take a decade to increase charter schools' footprint by just 10%, shouldn't we at least give these schools a greater chance?
Interesting that you should use the 10-year limit. The CFO of Boston and the CFO of the Boston public schools actually projected out what would happen with under just simply opening 3 charters a year just in Boston. And I'm sorry that I'm speaking less about Fall River, but Boston. Their rather conservative estimate was that we would end up having to close 45 schools in 10 years, and that we would be forced to give over $800 million. I mean, we talk about choice, and we talk about kids being trapped in failing schools, etc. I think that's what we're forced to sort of, confront as far as the narrative is concerned. My choice is to fight for my district public school, and I would like that choice to be equally respected when it comes to this ballot question, and it simply isn't. And I struggle, and I don't have a choice. I don't have a choice about where I can get to send my kids. I don't have the financial resources, tie, etc. And more than anything else, I believe in the public school system. I'm a new immigrant. I've been an immigrant twice. And I believe in democracy, and I believe in our democratic institutions, and our public schools are at the center, at the heart of our collective democratic life, and I don't want them to disappear.
I want to get a response now from the yes side. Again, a 1% increase, you feel that that's proportional?
Yes, 1% increase per year, no more than 1% increase per year, and no more than 12 charter schools. That no more is very important. When we write legislation, it's always not less than or not more than. Those little words mean a lot. I will talk about Fall River. In Fall River, we have 2 great charter schools. We have one that's been around for about 20 years, the Atlantis Charter School, and we have one that's only, I think it's in its 3rd year, the Argosy Collegiate Charter Public School. We are at our cap. So that means the rest of the citizens of Fall River, if you're not lucky enough to have your child go through the lottery and get into those charter schools, you're not going to have that choice in the future. And I think that's a shame. We talked about the disparity in the amount of spending between districts. Well, that's reflective, and we heard a lot about this during the presidential campaign, especially of Bernie Sanders. That's reflective of the fact that we have 2 Americas. As my mom always said, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And when you come from those communities that spend all that money on their schools, they also have other choices because they can afford private or parochial schools, where the parents that I represent in the city of Fall River do not have those choices, and we want to give them the same opportunities for educational choice.
Well, Senator Roderick's following up on that. However, there's no cap on that expansion, and that's a fact that worries some of your opponents here. Why wasn't there a limit placed in this referendum, and should there have been?
That's a danger with any referendum question. We have what's before us to vote on as citizens. Then it's going to be incumbent upon us in the legislature if we need to amend it or tweak it. We do that all the time. That's what we do every day, is we amend statutes and amend laws. Just because you authorize it doesn't mean they're going to be built. We see all the time, we hear all the time. There's one in Brockton, there's one here in Fall River of charter school proponents that wanted to build a new charter school but could never do it, could never get it off the ground. It is very, very difficult Ask the folks at Argosy, ask the folks at Atlantis, ask the folks at any charter school how difficult it is to get through the DESE, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, regulatory administrative process. It's not easy, and only if there's a great enough demand for the school will any new ones be built, and I want to give that opportunity for the citizens of the district that I represent.
And from the representatives from the no side, I know that the cap is something that you guys worry about, the fact that there isn't one.
Yeah, so I'd like to address this just for a moment and just take a slight turn in how I answer this question. So we've been spending a lot of time talking about school choice and talking about the cap, and maybe, I don't know, maybe it could be good to have a couple of new charter schools in some communities, but that's not what this ballot initiative does. This ballot initiative opens 12 charter schools in perpetuity per year. I do want to point out a couple of things. Senator Rodericks, you earlier in your opening remarks indicated that we should improve and enhance educational opportunities for all of our kids. Charter schools may be an opportunity for some kids, but they are not an opportunity for many children with disabilities. Charter schools have fewer special educators, fewer students with disabilities, and far poorer outcomes for those children with disabilities. And we need to do a better job and weed the garden before we add water willy-nilly to the plants and to the weeds.
I want to allow a 30-second response over this because I've heard this before, that a lot of your opponents feel like charter schools don't do enough to address students who have special needs or students who have English as a second language.
Right. So thank you for hosting this. I'm not going to use my 30 seconds on thanking you, but I will real quick. But I wanted to just quickly say in terms of ELL, English language learners, and children with disabilities, my niece is both. And she came to this country in 2010. And just as a result of being at her charter public school, she was able to learn how to speak English quicker and faster than her sister, who ended up staying in the district school. And then in terms of special needs, she had a speech impediment, she needed support, all of these different types of mechanisms, and I felt like I was living in the suburbs just by mere fact of the type of services that she was receiving. So this conversation in terms of whether or not we serve, it's a big myth, and it's a way to continue to hide under the fact that when it comes to students with special needs and English language learners, that both the district schools need to recognize that they need to step it up too. Because when you look at the kids who are going from one school to the next trying to receive their services, those kids don't get counted against the district.
Well, I want to turn the subject back to funding just here for a second, because that's a huge part of this debate. And a question for the No campaign: when a student moves from a traditional school, as you know, to a public charter school, the amount of funding goes with that student, it goes with them. That seems pretty straightforward. The child leaves, the funding goes with them. Why then is that not a fair proposition?
Because the cost doesn't go with the child. That child doesn't take 4% of the lighting bill. That child doesn't take 4% of the health care cost or 4% of the other charges that go in that classroom.
I know folks on the yes side, you feel like, obviously you feel the opposite. Would you like to respond?
Well, Senator Roderick cited the Mass Taxpayers Foundation study that just came out, and that was really helpful because it was the really first comprehensive analysis of charter schools' impact financially statewide. And what that study found was that there are 3.9% of public education children in charter public schools, and 3.9% of public education dollars go to those students. So in fact, the funding formula is working, because in Massachusetts, the money follows the child. Whether you move from Fall River to Somerset, or whether you move from a charter school to a district, the money follows the child. And because of disparities among district funding, which Adam cited earlier, that sometimes can get a little skewed. But overall, as a policy statewide, this funding formula is working, it's fair, it treats families equally, it treats districts equally, and we think it dispels the myth that somehow charter schools are getting some disproportionate share of public education dollars.
I want to ask one more question to the yes side here about funding, and this is according to American American Prospect magazine, your side has raised a lot of money, reportedly twice as much as the opposite side, much of which has come from outside Massachusetts. For example, Great Schools Massachusetts has received funds from Families for Excellent Schools. That's a New York nonprofit that many say is fueled by hedge fund managers. Other reported contributors include the heirs of Walmart and former New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg. So why should voters back or trust a campaign that seems to be fueled by money from outsiders?
Well, first of all, Adam, the other side, the No on 2 campaign has gotten over $5 million from the National Education Association in Washington, which is the National Teachers Union. So unfortunately or fortunately, this race has gone national and has national implications. Everybody across the country is watching this race. So we have money from outside the state coming in on both sides of the issue. But from my vantage point, what's really important to point out is that for the last 15 years, I've been the leading advocate for charter schools in Massachusetts. And for those 15 years, every year I've had to fight against the most powerful political force in this state, which is the Massachusetts Teachers Association. And every year they overwhelmed us with their money and their human resources, which is why we have more caps and stricter caps than any state in the country, because of the work the MTA did all these years in limiting our growth and suppressing the needs of families who are looking for public charter schools. So we think that this money that is coming in from donors that is helping us support our campaign is just leveling the playing field. And in fact, we're not going to double the money spent by the unions. It's actually going to be very close by the time we're done with their money coming in from the outside. So the myth that somehow we are distorting this by bringing outside money is, again, just twisting an equation where both sides are bringing outside money, but we're facing the No campaign, which has access to millions and millions and millions of dollars in membership dues. Earlier this year, the MTA took a vote and appropriated $9 million to fight this effort. So the money is there on both sides. Unfortunately or fortunately, we're going to break records on both sides of the campaign, yes and no. And we wish that these campaigns didn't focus on television and cost so much money. We wish we could do more campaigning like this, where we could talk to people locally. But to try to discredit the Yes on 2 campaign or charter schools because we have donors from outside of the state that are supporting us, just like the union has support from outside the state, feels unfair.
Do you, from the No campaign, feel it's a fair fight?
I absolutely do not. None of us, with respect, we drove here. We won't be getting a per mileage thing because we're volunteers. One of the things that I have to, as a parent, simply say is that I know where the money from the teachers' unions comes from. They come from teachers. And when we talk about teachers, we're actually talking about a teachers' union that is overwhelmingly women. This is, to invoke Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, who also is No on 2, we talk about the fact that this is a profession that is a gateway to economic security for women. And that's something that we should celebrate, because look at the outcomes. We are #1 in the country. We are #1 in the country. If we look at Massachusetts as a country, we are #9 in reading in the world. We are #2 in science in our TIMSS scores, only behind Singapore. This is, it's one of these things where the fabric of our democracy needs to be protected, and I do not know why the Walton family wants to basically come in and give a ton of money onto this campaign when they tried to come into Roxbury and wouldn't even guarantee $12 an hour.
Well, let me follow up here with a question in a report that the Yes side cited. They talked about this report from the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation, which claimed that per-student funding has increased steadily across the state, and often that charter school funding has remained a lot more stable than the traditional public school counterparts. What would you say to critics who claim the No campaign is blaming charter schools when this is really more of a budget issue?
I would say that, from what I understand, the Massachusetts Taxpayer Foundation report admits in a disclaimer that they did not look at how charters impact district budgets. And I believe Mayor Marty Walsh in Boston called it a completely inaccurate report. I believe they're probably thinking about the tuition reimbursements, but tuition reimbursement is not for full tuition. It is for the increase in tuition from year to year, and it has not been funded by the legislature as it should have been.
And
Oh, yes, and healthcare and special ed costs, which the Foundation Budget Review found were driving costs that are not funded by the state, are missing from that report.
Same question to the other side here. Do you feel charter schools are being unfairly blamed for budget issues?
I don't know if they're being unfairly blamed, but, you know, oftentimes when the message and the facts don't meet your narrative, you shoot the messenger. So the Mass Taxpayers Foundation was prepared to be shot because they knew that their report, that is very analytical, would be criticized. They would be criticized because the message did not fit the no on to school side, so they shoot the messenger. That's why it's very important to realize, as I said in my opening remarks, that both the Boston Globe, which is a left-leaning progressive newspaper, usually aligned with Democratic Party values, and the Boston Herald, which is a right-leaning, very conservative newspaper, more aligned with Republican Party values, both endorsed and affirmed the Mass Taxpayers Foundation report. And this issue of funding is a quantitative debate. You can do the math and figure this out. And the Mass Taxpayers did the arithmetic and figured this out. And what we found, and the numbers, I wish we could have had something to show the numbers, because when you start reciting numbers, everyone's eyes glaze over. But let me just give you some numbers. From 2012 to 2016 fiscal years in the city of Fall River, the after reimbursement net cost for charter schools in Fall River was $3.3 million. That's what the charter schools cost net after reimbursement in the city of Fall River. During that same time frame, state Chapter 70 funding that we provide from the state increased by $11.9 million to the city of Fall River's school system, and their operating budget rose $37.7 million in those 5 years. So you ask yourself, is it the charter schools that are causing budget issues in the Fall River School Department, or is it management of the funds?
I want to ask you about something that the No campaign talked about. They talked about school committees, and across the state they've come out against you on the No side. School committees, city councils, teachers, and hundreds of them, elected officials, many of whom these are folks that have expressed support for charter schools in the past. Why do you think that is, and why is that not a sign that your approach isn't the best?
Right. So, you know, I'm not a data person and I'm not into numbers, so I'm just going to talk about my own personal experience here as a woman of color, a single parent. What I find to be disenfranchising is that most people who are on the committees really don't look like us, don't have very little lived experience, but yet are making decisions as to what we need and what we should have. So this whole conversation, and even hearing Hershon talking about his choice, and while I appreciate the choice, you have to understand that we're talking about families who have very limited access to resources and opportunities, not two-income households who can choose to implement and supplement whatever services their children are not getting in their district schools. And furthermore, when you talk about the level 9 and 2 in Massachusetts, those are looking at in districts, not the urban districts or gateway cities. We're talking about throughout the state of Massachusetts. So let's be really clear on how great Massachusetts is. We still have a lot of work to do. And when we have school committees that are representative of the people that they're supposed to serve, then maybe there might be allocations to the neighborhoods where the resources are mostly needed. What's happening is when you look across this who's fighting, none of them look like us, right? But yet they can always scream, hoot, and holler about the fact that we should not reserve the right to choose the type of education that is best suited for our kids. So when you want to talk about choice, what about our choices? What about our opportunities when you don't have the funds to be able to provide your daughter with the quality education that she deserves? I can't live in in Jamaica Plain. I'm being priced out of certain neighborhoods. So Heshan, we have to really look at this conversation from who is at risk here, and we have to look at the children. And parents want choice. And if the school committee is not going to stand up and do what's right by those students, then we need to reevaluate how those school committees get elected, because most of them are part of the union and have heavy backing because they get elected by those they serve.
Are these school committees representative of the people?
I would think that we do live in America, we still can vote, and if you run for office, I think you actually need to get voted onto these school committees, and I would think that as the fiscal watchdogs of the school systems and the school districts, I would prefer to think that the voters themselves have the ability to choose what they think is best for their school system. I mean, it's funny because it always comes down to Boston, even though we're here in Fall River. But one of the things that we have to also talk about is governance, okay? I mean, if one of the issues that we have with charters, and again, we're talking a ballot question. We're not talking about whether charters are good or bad, but I will also say that charters, 60% of them don't have a parent or a student on their board. 30% are made up of folks in the financial industry. Whose schools is what we have to sort of talk about.
I want to ask you folks about that, because that's a common criticism of charter schools, the idea that these folks that are on the board are not local, that they're in the corporate world, that they are not accessible or accountable. How do you respond to those criticisms?
Can we split?
Can we split?
You could split the time that you have.
I'll be really quick. I don't know about Boston. I'm here in Fall River. I represent Fall River, and I can tell you the two charter schools here in Fall River, their boards are absolutely, I can name, we all know them. They're our community people. We take care of ourselves here in Fall River. There's too often Boston doesn't care about us, so we take care of ourselves. And our boards are made up of absolutely all local people. You know them by name, first name. You know their kids, you know their families. So it's absolutely local control. And the reason why school committees and city councils are coming out against it, it's simple. They have to get elected, and they want the Mass Teachers Association endorsement. And they're afraid of them.
So I'll take it on. I'm just Dominican, and I'm very passionate when I speak. Don't get afraid. So what I want, so you know what's up. So what I wanted to say really quick about the school committee and, the parent councils, even within the district schools, there are very few parents who are juggling 2 or 3 jobs that sit in these parent councils in the district schools. And mainly what you have are people who have access to wealth and opportunity sitting in these parent councils dictating what's important for parents of color and parents who have very little means. So in the example of the citywide parent council, which Heshan happens to sit on, if you look at it now, because I've criticized how many people of color are represented there, now they're increasing the number of black and brown parents. But the fact of the matter is that when we look at the parent council, right, there's very little activity even in the district schools, because families have opted out because they know that forever and ever, for the last 60 years, our rights and our needs have been disregarded. So you're expecting families to trust a system that has very little desire to do right by us.
I'll let the No campaign respond in just 1 second, but I do want to follow up with this, that there was a report earlier this year from Brown University, that found 31% of charter board members are from the financial or corporate world, and just 14% are parents. In fact, 60% of the charter schools here in Massachusetts, this report from Brown University found, have no parents whatsoever on that board. Doesn't that, and I'll give you another 30 seconds, doesn't that demonstrate a lack of accountability or transparency?
Well, you find charter school boards represent an innovation. We're trying something different about how to govern public schools. The Board of Trustees of a charter school, which are chosen within the school community and then has to be approved by the state. So we have a system of both local control but also accountability to the state. And this is a really important part of the charter school model. But we have some charter school boards that are almost all parents. We have charter school boards that have no parents. We have charter school boards that have a lot of financial people. We have charter school boards that have a lot of educators on them. Any kind of model you want to see, you can find. The schools that my children went to out in Western Massachusetts were almost all parents. There were no corporate, no financial people on it. So it's another myth that people are spreading to try to discredit the charter school community.
Are these charter school boards fair from the NOSA?
You know, it didn't sound like Brown University was perpetuating a myth. It sounds like they had a valid study that found that 60% of the boards for these private institutions, okay, these private boards, don't have a single parent on the board of directors, and that 31% of the individuals on that board, on the boards, are from the financial services sector. And those individuals, by the way, back to finance for a moment, there's an interesting fact. Charter schools are the only public schools in the state that are allowed to carry over an operational carryover budget from one year to the next. And, you know, Julia, you made a very interesting comment earlier about how a lot of these communities are strapped for cash. Well, let me tell you, in the last school year, the carryover was $28 million in the state, up from the previous year that was $20 million in the state. And so you have these members of the board who are from these financial services corporations, and they have this big glut of money, and that's all I have to say about that.
I'm going to give you an opportunity to, I want to talk about accountability a little bit more to let you continue sort of this conversation. But NBC 10, we ran a story earlier this year about a group of parents who felt that a local charter school here in Fall River was too strict to them. Some of the rules at the local charter was forbidding students from talking on the bus, issuing demerits for having the wrong sock color, and also punishing students by forcing them to wear a different color uniform. Some parents didn't like that, and they felt like they had no recourse because public charter schools are not overseen by these local school departments. So where does a parent go? And again, how would you respond to people who say there's not enough accountability or oversight for these charter schools?
The issue isn't accountability of oversight. The issue really is choice. Charter schools are different than traditional public schools. They have longer school days, they have longer school years, they have stricter discipline requirements, they have stricter dress code requirements. So as a parent, you have to choose. You have a choice. I think that's a good thing. I think choice is good. You can choose. Do you want to send your child to a school that's got a longer school day, that has a longer school year, that has a more strict discipline code? Then send them to a charter school, or at least try to get them into the lottery. Unfortunately, in Fall River, if they don't get in the kindergarten now, they're not going to get in because they're full. Or if you want status quo, if you're happy with the school year, the school calendar, the discipline at the traditional public schools, then you can choose to send your child to a traditional public school. These codes and these rules of the charter public school are published there. It's not a secret, and I can understand how some parents get upset that, you know, they're a little too strict at some of our charter schools.
Julia, do you want the last 30 seconds?
Sure. As a parent and as a single parent, I have to say that that structure and that discipline really helps me at home, and it's really about what works for you. What I have to say is what I find troubling is the lack of structure and the lack of discipline that I see when I visit district schools where kids have no sense of real learning environment. That to me I find to be a bit oppressive, and I think that when we look at that, this is the conversation that we need to have, is how do we find a balance? And going back to the choice, it's all about what works for you, and I think that it's important for us to recognize that when you're a parent, you have to choose. You have the right to choose what works best for your family because you know how your kids, some of my kids might do better in one environment than the next. But the question is like, I would love to know in terms of the district schools, like what are we doing to maintain a sense of organization, structure to ensure that our kids, when they graduate, can learn how to read and write.
Well, let me ask about, I want to give you an opportunity to speak about accountability because you haven't had that. I know that's a criticism that your side has about charter schools.
Yeah, so I just really quick, Julia, I want to say I'm very happy about your niece and that things are working out well for her. And every school is different. And sure, there are some good charter schools. But on the topic of discipline, I do want to point out that on average, Massachusetts charter schools discipline 14% of the total population of children with disabilities, compared with 5% at traditional public schools. Of the 23 top school districts with the highest discipline rate for students with disabilities, 21 are charter schools. Charter schools suspend 11.2% of disciplined children of a disability. Traditional public schools, 4.7%. And what's the outcome? The outcome is 10 of the 12 school districts with the highest special education student attrition rate are charter schools. And dropout rates. Children with disabilities at charter schools, 4.4% statewide dropout, compared to 2.8% for traditional districts. If you're a disabled child and you attend a charter school, you are 50% more likely to drop out. I do want to point out that there are districts that are doing innovation. In Holyoke, receiver Stevens Reich has extended the school day by 2 hours. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what kind of wonderful results he's able to achieve out there.
And I would like to add that charter schools were intended to be centers of innovation, to give parents choice for something unique. The state auditor has issued a report that says that is not happening. It's not being shared with the traditional public schools. Parents do what they feel is best for their child. I understand that. I'm a parent. Policymakers should do what is best for all children. And we would like to innovate in Fall River. We did innovate with our expanded day, which we had to cut because we didn't have the funding to provide that innovation any longer.
And we sort of mentioned that earlier, and I want to just add to what they mentioned there about discipline. There was a 2003 report from the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Economic Justice that found that of the 10 Massachusetts schools with the highest out-of-school suspension rates, 9 were charter schools. Why is that not a cause for concern?
Well, I think if you look at the data, Adam, that's important is that these are the suspensions, out-of-school suspensions, but the real issue is attrition. Are these students leaving the school? And in fact, we found that those schools that have what are called higher rates of out-of-school suspension are actually keeping their kids at a higher rate than most of the district schools that they're compared to. So let's be clear about what the end result has to be. The end result has to be is the outcome for those kids. And some of the schools have used out-of-school suspension as a way to build school culture and to be able to establish the kind of culture that Julia and the senator are talking about. But when you look at, you have to expand the conversation to look at attrition, which is how many people actually leave the school. And there's no data that supports that those children who are being suspended at a higher rate or those schools that might be using suspension at a higher rate are having a higher attrition. In fact, they have lower attrition rates. And again, this is about choice. Parents can choose these schools. The data is very available to people. If they think this is a good choice for their children, they choose it. If they don't have to. That's what choice is about and why we're trying to bring more choice to more families through this ballot question.
I want to take a step back for a second and ask the No campaign a question just about charter schools in general here. Both a 2015 Stanford and an MIT study found that charters do outperform traditional public schools as far as average academic growth, and as well as here in Massachusetts, MCAS scores, and they did show that they were better for folks with special needs. Why isn't the charter method a proven one, and why aren't you more supportive of it?
Absolutely not. The charter method is a failure in Massachusetts for children with disabilities. The MIT report, if you dig back to the end, in Chapter 6, where they talk about threats to validity, you will discover that they include 2 groups of the population. Group 1 is children who have disabilities who enroll in a charter school and then do well because they found a good charter school. And it also includes the population of students who enroll in a charter school, are punished out, return to the home district, and their eventual performance in the home district are included in that population. You'll also find that when you review the students' approach for the methodology, you'll find that she used fuzzy matching algorithm, which gave her in the mid-90s for a success rate. I work with data. The only way you get a mid-90s rate is if you're using highly liberal definitions when you're doing a match. That means if Mike Robinson's scored a perfect score on the MCAS, and another Mike Robinson applied for a charter school 5 years prior. She's saying that's the same Mike Robinson.
So I'm going to just quickly say is that when you look at students who have special needs in our district schools, they end up in subset classrooms. And basically, in charter schools, they're part of the inclusion. So that means our kids are being educated within the general population. They don't get sent, like we used to call it back in the day, to the basement. And I think that we need to look at how we educate our students who have special needs across the board, both district and charter, and I'm being really honest about the work that needs to happen. But I have a concern is the stigma that what I have seen in charter public schools is that our kids come in performing at 2 to 3 grade levels below when they're on IEPs, because what's happening is in the district, sometimes they oversubscribe those IEPs, and kids are subjected to a lifetime sentence of being on an IEP, when in reality, they don't need those services. And I know this for a fact because I work with both district and charter parents, and I have worked with parents who have come in, their students have come in with an IEP, and within years are able to reduce those services. But for some reason, and we know this because of the Department of Education in the federal level, and I'm not a buff like you with the data, but I do remember that they came into Massachusetts, and to Boston in particular, to look at the fact that Boston public schools were oversubscribing IEPs, and most recently, they were neglecting to educate English language learners. So when you're a person who doesn't know how to speak English, and you come into this country, and they automatically think that you have a learning disability.
I understand your time's expired, Ms. Mejia. I just want to give you a quick 30-second follow-up.
Yeah, just to follow up really quickly. So I have 3 children with disabilities, 2 on IEP. My son, who's now in our home district, he made honor roll, he's playing football, he's been fully accepted. You know, we're not talking about inclusion versus exclusion. In fact, I will tell you, when they were at the charter school and they moved his desk 10 feet away from the other children and taped a circle around his desk to show where he was allowed to be, that is not an inclusive environment. That is the definition of exclusion. When they sent my kindergarten daughter to march down the hall in front of all the classrooms to go to the alternative room, where you have K through 12 students being disciplined in one room, that is not inclusion, that is exclusion. When you are using suspension as a trap door, that is exclusion. That is not inclusion. At charter schools, 11.2% of students with disabilities disciplined miss at least 1 day of school due to suspension, compared to 4.7% of similar students in traditional public schools.
Your time's expired, Mr. Robinson. Thanks. I do want to ask the no side another question, though. We talked about status quo, and the yes side talked about it. And most of these Massachusetts charter schools are concentrated in lower performing districts like here in Fall River. Even this new proposed law would give priority to districts whose performance is in the bottom 25%. Isn't that a good thing, to try something new for these areas where it's not working out well?
Sure. Once again, our choice is a wonderful thing if it respects the choice of everyone and the financial and economic viability of every single school. This ballot question will not do it. When you read the ballot question, it simply says if there are more than 12 applications, that preference will be given for the bottom 25%. There may be 12 applications for Andover, or Wellesley, or Weston, or Provincetown, where they spend $30,000 per pupil. That's what this ballot question actually says. When we talk about failing schools, and we talk about ELL failures, for example, Boston International School is a high school in Boston that has 84% ELL students. At 16 years old, they come from other countries, sometimes functionally illiterate in their own language. By 22, they graduate. 3 out of 4 of them go to college. If that is not a mark of success, I have no idea what we're talking about here. And that is an incredibly sad example for me to bring up, Because of budget cuts, they lost their librarian this year. And because they lost their librarian, they lost their accreditation, which when it comes to applying for college, which they do pretty darn well, this is going to be a problem for them going forward. We have 8 high schools in Boston that send more as a proportion of their populations than Belmont High does.
Well, let me follow up with this question, because currently there's, the numbers are a little different, but there's roughly 30,000 Massachusetts students who want to attend a charter school but are stuck on a wait list. The Boston Globe reports there are just 22 charters in Boston. Other cities have, Denver is 54, 94 in Detroit. They're similarly sized. Doesn't that show that we should have some more charters?
I'd be happy to answer that. According to DESE, it's 32,646 charters. 3 of them account for about 27.5% of all of those wait lists. When you understand that 10% actually include BPS in district charters, you have to kind of get rid of them. You have to subtract that. That brings you down to 29,186 charters. When you then look, as you do as BPS does, and erase charter lists from one year to the next, you arrive at 20,141. Now, interestingly, BPS has a higher wait list than all of the charters in Massachusetts, double the amount that's in BPS. Snowden International has 1,000 students on a wait list. We know that across Massachusetts, there are 15,000 people, young people, who are waiting to get into a kindergarten slot. That's proven to actually eliminate the achievement gap, and yet we're not funding those 15,000, 4,000 in Boston, 15,000 throughout, that would bring a measure of economic stability to their families and learning to those young children. Instead, we are trying to push through this ballot question that's fiscally irresponsible, that has absolutely no accountability whatsoever, and the NAACP and Black Lives Matter oppose.
To the yes side, there is a lot of students on a wait list on both sides of the coin here. Why will more charter schools help?
Adam, if I could just go back, we didn't have a chance to respond. You had asked the question of why it's only 1% per year and why a lot of this is focused in the so-called gateway cities. It's because that's where the income inequality is. That's where poor people live. That's where people that don't have choices. You think a charter school is going to go to Wellesley or Belmont or Andover? I don't think so. They have tremendous public schools, and they have families that can afford any private. Those kids go to Choate and Lincoln Academy and Moses Brown or Tabor, okay? But it's what districts? You can name the cities that have reached a cap: Fall River, Lawrence, Holyoke, Chelsea, Boston. You know, cities that just where their families can't afford any other choices, and these families are screaming, please, can I choose an educational model that best fits my child? And that's why these caps have been reached at these poor cities. In this income divide, whether it reflects in the housing values in the communities that they live in, also definitely reflects on their abilities to have choice and to choose what's best for their child. We have a minute left, if you want to.
Thank you. So, you know, I also think about working families and immigrants. My mom didn't even finish 5th grade. So for me, I understand how important education is. This conversation, which is why I'm so passionate, is personal and professional, right? So in terms of really having access, Imagine being a parent who just wants the best for your child and recognizing that because of a cap, because of systems that are put in place, that you won't have that opportunity. So for me, my appeal in terms of really helping people understand this, it's not just around black and brown. We're looking at families who have very limited access to resources, immigrant families who come to this country to try to make a better life for themselves and don't even know how to how to navigate the system. But then you have families who know how to pick their right district schools and are able to get into the higher performing schools.
I'm going to cut you short, Ms. Mejia, just because I want to get one more question in before we run out of time here. I didn't have a question for any specific one of the panelists, and I told them that prior, except maybe this one is probably best for you, Senator Rodrigues. I don't think there's any disagreement here that this is an important issue, that it's a complicated issue in a lot of ways. Wouldn't Massachusetts be better off coming up with a solution through the legislative process, bringing all these parties to the table, rather than letting individual voters decide on such a complex issue? I want to give you 30 seconds on this.
Absolutely. We shouldn't be voting on legalizing recreational use of marijuana, but we're going to. We shouldn't be voting on a ballot question that's going to limit where you can get your produce from. We shouldn't be voting on a ballot question to add another slot parlor in the Commonwealth. But guess what? Our Constitution allows this process.
And I'm going to just cut you off because I want to give the other side 30 seconds.
I just wanted to add in very quickly regarding choice. You know, when you are building your charter school, and when 19 charter schools out of 74 in the state, when 25% of charter schools have an FTE, have a full-time equivalent count of 0 for special educators, you're not ready to accept all your students, and that's in all communities.
Thanks, Mr. Robinson. I want to get to the final statement here, and Ms. Cusick.
I want to say thank you to everyone who took the time tonight to listen in on this important debate. Question 2 makes promises without saying how it will deliver on those promises, and it distracts us from talking about the real promise that has not been kept, the promise to provide all of our children in all of our schools, regardless of their zip code, with equality in education. And it distracts us from discussing how to offer innovations and positive reforms under the state's single-focused, test-based accountability system. We share a common goal on this stage. Yet this question divides us, and it preys on our natural desire to seek out what we believe is best for our children. It is not possible to run 2 parallel separate systems for the price of one. If we cannot afford the schools we have now, why would we create new ones? Why are Wall Street outsiders who do not send their children to school in Massachusetts investing money in question 2? These out-of-state billionaires see privatizing education as an opportunity for corporations to profit with public money. Public education was born in Massachusetts, and it's an essential component of our democracy that we must not jeopardize. We should be working together to provide every single student with the resources they need to be successful, whether they live in a wealthy suburb or a poor city. The truth is, our schools are not failing. They are being failed by a system that allows the neediest kids to get the least, and an accountability system that values test scores above all else.
Thanks, Mrs. Cusick. I have to cut you short, Senator Rogers. Please, audience, please, we've been respectful on that. Senator.
Thank you, Adam, and thank all of you for coming this evening, and for all of those watching at home on television or online, because I would hope that we don't just wait for every so many years when there's a ballot question, that we can have real debate on how to better provide a public education system for our children, because there is nothing more important that we talk about, that we as a community should all talk about, than public education. This is about choice. We should all have the ability. I always joke, I was lucky, I guess in a way, but for the first 12 years of my school, K through 12, every one of my teachers had the same first name, Sister. And I had a lot of discipline. And my parents appreciated the discipline, and I hope that it taught me values in my life of how to respect people, respect everyone's opinion, and that I show that every day when I'm representing you at the State House. I know many public school teachers who send their kids to parochial and private schools. And they often say, "Oh, Mike, I know you're yes on 2, but my union's telling me I got to be no on 2." And I'm like, so-and-so, but both your kids are at Bishop Stang. Both your kids are at, Holy Family, Holy Name School. Your kids go to St. Philomena's in Portsmouth. How can you deny choice? That's good that you have the money and you can afford it, but why shouldn't someone that's on the 3rd floor on Plain Street have that same opportunity to choose the educational model.
And Senator Rodericks, I appreciate that, but we've run out of time
Oh,
here.
they're telling me 30 seconds, I'm sorry.
We got about 20 seconds on the clock, so thank you.
Okay.
I want to thank
Okay.
everyone so much. It was a great, respectful debate, and we really, really appreciate it. I want to thank everyone who participated, as well as our sponsors, NBC 10, Bristol Community College, and South Coast Media. A full wrap on tonight's debate on NBC 10 News at 11, and thank you all for watching. Good night from Fall River.
You have to get the plug in.